The rain falls in sheets across the tile roof, each drop striking with the persistence of a heartbeat that refuses to stop. Inside the traditional house, paper screens glow softly with lamplight, casting elongated shadows that dance and shift with every breath of wind that seeps through the cracks. The family sleeps, unaware of what waits beyond the threshold, patient and inevitable. In the garden, beneath the eaves where the rain cannot reach, something stands motionless, watching the house with eyes that have witnessed 10,000 final breaths. This is not a ghost story, though it touches the realm of the dead. This is not a tale of monsters, though what waits outside possesses a power more absolute than any demon. What stands in that garden, in countless gardens across Japan throughout the centuries, has been given many names. But the most enduring is Shinigami, the death god, the spirit that knows your appointed hour. What if death itself possessed consciousness? What if it could choose to appear before you, not as an abstraction or a medical event, but as a presence with intention, with purpose, with a face you might recognize in your final moments? The question settles like cold water in the stomach, because somewhere deep in our collective memory, we suspect we already know the answer. We have always known that death watches, that it waits, that it comes when called, and sometimes when it is not. The threshold between life and death is not a line, but a space, a liminal realm where certainty dissolves and the rules of the waking world no longer apply. In Japanese consciousness, this threshold has always been crowded with entities that serve neither heaven nor hell, that exist in the gray spaces where morality becomes meaningless, and only transition matters. The Shinigami dwell in this space, and their presence in folklore, in whispered accounts, in the persistent unease that grips certain places and certain nights, suggests something too detailed, too consistent across centuries and regions, to dismiss as mere superstition. In the flickering lamplight of Edo period tea houses and theaters, something new began to take shape in the Japanese imagination. Death itself was acquiring a face, a voice, and most unsettling of all, a will of its own. The Shinigami, those enigmatic gods of death, emerged not from ancient scrolls or temple teachings, but from the vibrant, sometimes desperate creativity of common storytellers who understood that people feared not just dying, but the loneliness and uncertainty of the journey beyond. Before the Edo period, which stretched from 1603 to 1868, Japanese concepts of death existed in vastly different forms. Buddhism had brought the notion of reincarnation and karmic consequence, while Shinto traditions spoke of Yomi, the shadowy land of the dead, a place of pollution and decay rather than judgment. Death was impersonal, a transition governed by cosmic law rather than individual agents. The deceased would face Emma-O, the great judge of the underworld, but there were no psychopomps in the Western sense. No singular figures whose specific duty was to collect souls at the moment of death. The gap between life and afterlife was vast and abstract, populated by concepts rather than characters. The transformation began in the bustling streets of Edo itself, the city we now know as Tokyo. This was an urban explosion unlike anything Japan had previously experienced. By the early 1700s, Edo had become one of the largest cities in the world, home to over 1 million people packed into neighborhoods that ranged from wealthy merchant quarters to desperate slums. In this churning human density, death was everywhere and nowhere, constant yet impersonal. Disease swept through tenements. Fires consumed entire districts. Failed harvests drove people to starvation. The old religious framework still held meaning, but they felt distant, designed for a different world. People began to hunger for stories that made death feel less like cosmic machinery and more like something that could be understood, negotiated with, perhaps even tricked. The kusazoshi, those cheap woodblock printed books that flooded the market from the mid-18th century onward, became the laboratory where Shinigami took their modern form. These were not sacred texts or philosophical treatises, but popular entertainment, often dismissed by the educated elite as crude amusement for the masses. One of the earliest and most influential examples appeared in 1776, a kibiyoshi, or yellow-covered book titled Shinigami. The plot was deceptively simple. A desperately poor man encounters a mysterious figure who teaches him to see invisible spirits hovering around sick people. When the Shinigami appears at a patient's head, the sick will recover. When it appears at their feet, death is certain. Armed with this knowledge, the man becomes a renowned physician, earning wealth by predicting who will live and who will die. But here is where the story reveals its deeper currents. The Shinigami in this tale is not a cosmic force or a demon of Buddhist hell. It is something far more interesting and disturbing. It possesses personality, agenda, and a twisted sense of humor. When the protagonist inevitably grows greedy and tries to save a patient, the Shinigami has marked for death by turning the sickbed around. The death god responds not with divine wrath, but with calculated revenge. It shows the man a vast cavern filled with candles, each representing a human life. The man's own candle has burned down to a tiny stub. He begs for more time, and the Shinigami seems to agree, appearing to light a new candle from his dying flame. Instead, the transfer extinguishes the last flicker, and the man dies. It is trickery, dark comedy, a joke with mortal stakes. This narrative structure reveals something essential about how Edo period culture was reimagining death. The Shinigami here is neither purely evil nor benevolent. It offers opportunity even as it enforces cosmic rules. It can be temporarily fooled, but never truly beaten. Most importantly, it is personal. It speaks, bargains, and remembers. This was radically different from the abstract wheel of karma, or the bureaucratic judgment of Emao's court. The Shinigami made death into a relationship. Kabuki theater seized upon these possibilities with characteristic excess. On stages lit by oil lamps, with elaborate costumes and stylized movements, Shinigami appeared as dramatic characters who could command audience attention. Actors developed specific gestures and vocal patterns for portraying these beings. Unlike the skeletal Western Grim Reaper with his agricultural side, Shinigami and Kabuki often appeared humanoid but subtly wrong, their faces painted in ways that suggested otherness without complete monstrosity. They might dress as wandering monks or mysterious strangers, only revealing their true nature through supernatural knowledge or impossible feats. The Kabuki play Tokaido Yotsuya Kaiden, first performed in 1825, features supernatural elements that dance around Shinigami imagery without naming them directly. The vengeful ghost Oiwa operates with death god logic, appearing at moments of doom, her presence a guarantee of mortal conclusion. The play demonstrated how the Shinigami concept had permeated broader supernatural storytelling, influencing how death itself was dramatized and personified. What separated these Japanese death gods fundamentally from Western conceptions was their moral ambiguity and their relationship to fate versus choice. The Western Grim Reaper, influenced heavily by Christian theology and medieval plague imagery, functions as an absolute enforcer of God's will. When death comes calling with his scythe, there is no negotiation, no tricks, no relationship beyond terrified submission. The Reaper is fate incarnate, impersonal despite its skeletal personification. Shinigami occupied stranger territory. They enforced death's inevitability, yes, but the story suggested they had preferences, moods, perhaps even the capacity for limited mercy or spite. They could be temporarily deceived, though punishment inevitably followed. They might offer forbidden knowledge, as in the physician tale, creating scenarios where human greed and mortality intersected with tragic irony. Some tales hinted that Shinigami themselves were not original cosmic forces, but transformed beings, perhaps humans who had died in particular ways and taken on this role, suggesting a bureaucracy of death rather than death as singular entity. This reflected deeper currents in Edo period thought. Buddhism taught that all existence was suffering and impermanence, yet also offered paths to enlightenment and escape from the cycle. Shinto found divinity in nature and ancestry, blurring lines between the living, dead, and never-living spirits. Confucian ethics emphasized social duty and hierarchical order. The Shinigami emerged in this philosophical crossroads, embodying contradictions. They were agents of natural law yet possessed individual will. They were terrifying yet sometimes darkly helpful. They proved mortality's absolute nature while suggesting death might have loopholes for the clever or desperate. The literary evolution continued through the 19th century. Rakugo storytellers, those masters of solo comedic narrative, adapted Shinigami tales for oral performance, adding layers of humor and social commentary. In their hands, the Death God story became a vehicle for exploring Edo society's anxieties about money, class mobility, and the desperation that poverty created. The man who gains the power to see Shinigami is always poor, always struggling, always one disaster away from ruin. The supernatural bargain offers escape, but demands a spiritual price. By the time Japan entered the Meiji period in 1868 and began its rapid modernization, Shinigami had become thoroughly embedded in popular consciousness. They appeared in folklore collections, ghost story compilations, and the emerging forms of modern literature. Writers like Lafcadio Hearn, documenting Japanese supernatural traditions for Western audiences, recognized Shinigami as distinctly Japanese creations, different in character from Chinese or Western death deities. The cultural shift that had occurred was profound. Abstract religious concepts of death, karmic justice, and spiritual transition had been supplemented, perhaps even partially replaced in popular imagination by these tangible entities. Death was no longer just a process or destination, but a cast of characters with their own mysterious logic. This transformation reflected broader changes in Edo period, Japan. As urbanization intensified, as literacy spread through cheaper publishing, as theater became mass entertainment, culture shifted from elite-controlled religious narratives to stories created by and for common people. Shinigami represented death, democratized and dramatized, removed from temple authority, and placed into stories anyone could access. They embodied the Edo period's strange mixture of fatalism and hustle, accepting mortality's inevitability while constantly seeking angles and opportunity. In a society where natural disasters, disease, and political instability made death a constant companion, these stories offered neither false hope nor pure despair, but something more complex. A recognition that death, like life, might be negotiated with, even if the house always wins eventually. In the autumn of 2006, a manga series began its transformation of death itself into something sleek, modern, and oddly seductive. Death Note introduced millions of readers to a Shinigami named Ryuk, a creature of gothic design with skeletal features and an addiction to apples, who drops a supernatural notebook into the human world out of sheer boredom. The premise was simple, yet intoxicating. Write a name in the notebook while picturing the person's face, and they die. The series became a cultural phenomenon, spawning anime adaptations, live-action films, and endless debates about morality and power. But what made Death Note particularly fascinating was how it reimagined the Shinigami, transforming these death gods from figures of traditional folklore into characters with personalities, hierarchies, and a bureaucratic otherworld that mirrored our own institutions. Ryuk was neither hero nor villain, neither savior nor tormentor. He was an observer, detached and amused, watching human drama unfold with the casual interest of someone channel surfing on a lazy afternoon. This portrayal struck a chord with contemporary audiences because it made death itself seem almost mundane, stripped of its terror through familiarity and dark humor. The Shinigami realm in Death Note was depicted as a wasteland of bored immortals, gambling with dice made of bone, killing humans not out of malice, but simply because that was their function, their job, their eternal bureaucratic duty. It was death as middle management, reaping souls like filing paperwork. Yet, beneath this modern veneer, the series was tapping into something far older, drawing from wells of Japanese folklore that stretched back centuries. The word Shinigami itself is relatively modern in the grand scheme of Japanese mythology. Unlike the ancient kami of Shinto tradition or the imported Buddhist concepts of death and rebirth, Shinigami as a distinct concept emerged primarily during the Edo period, somewhere between 1600 and the mid-1800s. They appeared in theatrical performances, in ghost stories told around flickering lanterns, in the popular literature of common people, rather than in the sacred texts of temples. These early Shinigami were often depicted as psychopomps, spirits who guided the dying to the afterlife, or sometimes as malevolent entities who whispered suicide into the ears of the desperate. They existed in that uncertain space between metaphor and belief, between psychological projection and supernatural encounter. But it was during the Meiji era, that dramatic period of modernization and upheaval from 1868 to 1912, that something curious began to happen. As Japan rapidly transformed from a feudal society into an industrial power, as Western medicine competed with traditional healing practices, as old certainties crumbled and new anxieties emerged, reports of Shinigami sightings began to surface with surprising consistency. These were not the dramatic, elaborate apparitions of folklore. They were quieter, stranger, more unsettling in their ordinariness. Hospital records from Tokyo, personal diaries, letters to newspapers, testimonies collected by early folklorists all describe encounters with pale figures at moments of extreme crisis. A young woman dying of tuberculosis in 1893 wrote to her sister describing a man in outdated clothing standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with eyes that seemed impossibly old. He said nothing, made no gesture, simply observed with what she described as neither kindness nor cruelty, but something else entirely. A kind of professional interest, she wrote, like a doctor examining a patient, but more distant, as if she were an insect under glass. A soldier wounded during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 reported seeing a figure in white sitting beside his cot in a field hospital. The figure had the appearance of a young man, he said, but when you looked at the eyes, you knew this was something that had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. The wounded soldier asked if he was going to die. The figure did not answer, but simply inclined its head slightly, as if acknowledging a question it heard constantly and had long ago grown weary of answering. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their consistency across different witnesses who had no contact with each other. The descriptions align in peculiar ways. The figures are almost always described as pale, not ghostly or translucent, but pale in the way of someone who has not seen sunlight in centuries. They wear clothing that seems subtly wrong for the period, either too old-fashioned or too simple, as if fashion and its changes are beneath their notice. Most strikingly, witnesses consistently mention the eyes. Ancient eyes. Tired eyes. Eyes that have witnessed uncountable deaths and long ago stopped feeling anything about the process. The most detailed account comes from the winter of 1923, just months after the Great Kanto earthquake that devastated Tokyo and Yokohama. A merchant named Takahashi Hirogaki fell gravely ill with pneumonia, complicated by injuries he had sustained during the earthquake. He lingered between life and death for nearly 2 weeks in a hospital in the Asakusa district. During his illness, he kept a journal, writing in it during moments of lucidity. His daughter preserved these writings, and they were later published in a collection of earthquake testimonies in 1931. Takahashi described repeated visits from a figure he initially believed was a doctor, or perhaps a hospital administrator, making rounds. The figure would appear at various times, always standing near the window of his room, looking out at the damaged city below. Takahashi wrote that the figure seemed to be waiting for something, like a traveler at a train station checking a schedule. He was struck by how unremarkable the figure appeared. Not frightening, not dramatic, just a person standing quietly, except for those eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless winters. On the 5th night of his illness, when his fever was at its highest and the doctors had privately told his family to prepare for the worst, Takahashi attempted to speak to the figure. He asked, as the soldier had decades before, if this was his time to die. The figure finally turned from the window and looked directly at him. Takahashi wrote that the gaze was neither warm nor cold, neither sympathetic nor indifferent. It was the look of someone doing their job, he wrote, nothing more and nothing less. The figure spoke only once, and Takahashi recorded the words carefully. Not yet, the figure said, but I will return when it is time. No one keeps me waiting forever. Takahashi survived his pneumonia, recovering slowly over the following weeks. The figure did not appear again during his convalescence. He lived another 18 years, dying of heart failure in 1941. According to his daughter's later testimony, on the night of his death, her father became agitated in his final hours, saying repeatedly that the man from the hospital was back, standing by the window again, and this time he looked ready to leave. These testimonies occupy a fascinating threshold space in our understanding of death and dying. Modern psychology might interpret them as hallucinations brought on by fever, by the brain's response to trauma, by the neurological chaos of near-death experiences. The temporal lobe, when stressed by illness or injury, can produce vivid hallucinations. Oxygen deprivation creates altered states of consciousness. The dying brain, some researchers suggest, generates comforting or meaningful visions as a kind of final mercy. Yet this explanation, while scientifically sound, somehow fails to capture the full strangeness of these accounts. Why do the hallucinations take such consistent forms across different individuals? Why the recurring details of pale skin, ancient eyes, detached observation? Why do these figures never offer comfort or warning, never speak prophecies or relay messages from the dead? They simply watch and wait, present at the threshold but never quite crossing it themselves. Perhaps what we are witnessing in these accounts is not evidence of supernatural entities, but something equally profound about human consciousness at its limits. When we stand at the edge of our own mortality, when illness or injury forces us to confront the reality of our ending, perhaps our minds create a representation of death itself. Not death as the skeletal reaper of European tradition, not death as punishment or reward, but death as process, as transition, as the simple fact of ending. The Shinigami of these Meiji and Taisho era testimonies are bureaucrats of the afterlife in a way that Death Note would later echo. They are neither demons to be feared nor angels to be welcomed. They are functionaries, cosmic clerks whose job is to witness the transition from life to death and ensure it happens according to whatever unfathomable schedule governs such things. This conception of death removes both the comfort of meaning and the terror of malice. Death becomes neither friend nor enemy, neither punishment nor reward. It simply is, and these pale figures with their ancient eyes are its patient representatives. In traditional cultures worldwide, the moment of death has always been seen as a liminal space, a threshold between worlds where normal rules temporarily suspend. The dying person stands with one foot in life and one in death, existing temporarily in both states and fully in neither. It is not surprising that such moments might produce visions of beings who themselves seem to exist in perpetual liminality, neither fully present nor absent, neither living nor dead, neither kind nor cruel. The modern popularity of Death Note and similar reimaginings of death gods perhaps speaks to a contemporary hunger for this same detachment. In an age of medical intervention that can prolong dying almost indefinitely, in a culture that often treats death as a failure rather than a natural conclusion, there is something almost comforting about imagining death as merely a bureaucratic process handled by bored immortal. It strips away the weight of meaning, the burden of judgment. You die not because you deserve it, or because the universe has plans, but simply because your name gets written down, because your time comes up, because somewhere a pale figure with ancient eyes decides it is finally your turn. The historical testimonies remind us that humans have always sought to put a face on death, to transform the abstract terror of non-existence into something we can see and perhaps understand. Whether these visions are supernatural encounters or psychological constructions matters less than what they reveal about how we process our own mortality. At the threshold of death, witnesses consistently report seeing not horror but simple presence, not judgment but observation. The Shinigami waits, watches, and when the time comes, presumably guides us across whatever boundary separates this world from whatever comes next. In the end, perhaps that is the true gift of these pale figures with their ancient, tired eyes. They do not promise meaning or threaten punishment. They simply acknowledge the reality of ending, standing patient witness to the most universal and most solitary journey each of us must eventually take. The trees grow differently here. Deep in the Aokigahara forest at the base of Mount Fuji, the roots twist over black volcanic rock, creating natural pathways that seem to guide visitors deeper into the shadows. The branches overhead weave so tightly that even at midday, the forest floor remains in perpetual twilight. This is Japan's most infamous location, a place where the natural beauty masks a darker purpose. For decades, people have entered these 35 square kilometers of woodland with the intention of never leaving. But according to those who have walked these paths, both as potential victims and as the volunteers who search for them, they are never truly alone among these trees. Takeshi Yamada has been a forest patrol volunteer for 12 years. Every month, he and others like him venture into the designated zones where deaths most frequently occur. Their mission is simple on paper: find those who might be saved and recover those who cannot be. But the reality of the work defies such simple description. In an interview conducted in 2018, Yamada described an experience that has become disturbingly common among volunteers. He was searching a section of forest, approximately 3 kilometers from the most frequently used entrance, an area the volunteers have grimly nicknamed the Dead Zone due to the concentration of discoveries made there over the years. The air felt different, he explained. Not colder exactly, but heavier, as though something was pressing against his chest from the inside. He had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when the sensation began. The feeling of being observed, not by curious eyes, but by something patient. Something that had all the time in the world and was in no hurry to reveal itself. Yamada stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening. The forest was silent. In 12 years of patrols, he had learned to recognize the normal sounds of Aokigahara: the distant call of birds near the forest edge, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the occasional whisper of wind through the upper canopy. But in these deeper sections, in places where the canopy grows thick and the volcanic rock absorbs all sound, the silence becomes absolute. It is in this silence, he said, that you realize you are being watched. He described turning slowly in a circle, scanning the spaces between the trees. The technique the volunteers use is specific. They do not look directly at any one point, but rather let their peripheral vision do the work. It is an old hunter's trick, based on the understanding that human eyes detect movement more effectively at the edges of vision. What Yamada saw, or thought he saw, was a shape that maintained a consistent distance from him. As he turned, it seemed to shift position, always staying just at the limit of clear sight. When he stopped turning, the shape stopped moving. When he took a step forward, it retreated by the same measure. And when he finally abandoned the search for the day and began walking back toward the entrance, he had the unmistakable sensation that something followed precisely 3 meters behind him, matching his pace step for step. Yamada's experience is not unique. Interviews with over 30 forest patrol volunteers conducted between 2010 and 2020 reveal a pattern of similar encounters. Approximately 70% of regular volunteers report the sensation of being watched in certain areas of the forest. Nearly 40% describe seeing shapes or figures that vanish when viewed directly. What makes these testimonies particularly compelling is their consistency. The volunteers come from different backgrounds, patrol at different times, and often work alone, yet their descriptions align with remarkable precision. They speak of presences that do not approach or threaten, but simply observe. They describe an atmosphere of patient waiting, as though whatever inhabits these spaces has no need to act, content instead to witness the slow procession of human despair that passes through. The distinction drawn in Japanese folklore between yurei and Shinigami provides a framework for understanding what witnesses claim to encounter in Aokigahara. Yurei are the spirits of the dead who cannot move on, trapped by the circumstances of their deaths or the strength of their earthly attachments. Traditional accounts describe them as wearing white burial clothing, with long black hair obscuring their faces, and lacking feet as they float above the ground. They are said to haunt the places where they died or where they experienced profound emotional trauma. In a forest where hundreds have taken their lives over the past several decades, the idea of yurei seems almost inevitable. But witnesses in Aokigahara describe something else as well, something that does not fit the profile of restless spirits. Shinigami, the death gods of Japanese folklore, are entities with a different purpose entirely. They do not haunt or linger. They come to collect. Traditional stories depict them as neutral figures, neither good nor evil, simply performing the function assigned to them by cosmic order. They appear when death is imminent, not as cause but as escort. Several volunteers have described encounters they classify specifically as Shinigami rather than yurei, and the distinction is telling. These figures, they report, possess a quality of intentionality that the more passive presences lack. They move with purpose. They position themselves strategically. And most disturbingly, they seem to arrive before the death occurs, as though aware of what is about to unfold. Kenji Sato, a volunteer who began patrolling in 2014, described finding a man sitting at the base of a tree, conscious and apparently unharmed, but surrounded by what Sato described as a circle of shadow that seemed deeper than the natural darkness of the forest. The shadows, he insisted, were not cast by the trees or any physical object. They simply existed in a ring around the man, roughly 2 meters in diameter. When Sato called out to him, the man did not respond. When he approached and physically touched his shoulder, the man finally looked up, and his expression was one of complete resignation. He told Sato that the guide had already arrived, and it was too late to turn back. Sato managed to convince him to walk out of the forest that day. The man is alive, currently receiving ongoing mental health treatment, but he maintains that what he saw in the forest was real. That something had come for him, and only Sato's intervention had broken its claim. The phenomenon of seeing figures at the edge of vision is reported not only by volunteers, but also by survivors, those who entered the forest intending to die, but ultimately chose to leave. Yuki Nakamura, whose name has been changed to protect her privacy, shared her testimony with a suicide prevention organization in 2016. She had entered Aokigahara on a Tuesday morning in autumn, carrying a length of rope and a bottle of sleeping pills. She walked for over an hour, searching for a location that felt right, though she could not articulate what criteria she was using. Eventually, she settled on a small clearing where the tree branches overhead created an almost cathedral-like space. As she prepared, she became aware of a presence. Not a sound or a movement, but a certainty that she was not alone. She described the sensation as similar to being in a room and suddenly realizing that another person has entered, even though you have not heard them or seen them yet. The knowledge simply arrives fully formed in your consciousness. She turned to look behind her and saw nothing. But when she returned her attention to the task at hand, the presence intensified. It was, she said, in her peripheral vision. Always in her peripheral vision. A tall, thin shape that seemed to be composed more of absence than substance, as though something was blocking the light without actually being there. What disturbed her most was not fear, but the quality of patience emanating from this presence. It did not urge or threaten. It simply waited. She described feeling that this entity had witnessed this scene hundreds of times before and would witness it hundreds of times again. That her individual tragedy was merely one note in a long, sorrowful song the forest had been singing for years. This patient waiting, this sense of cosmic indifference, triggered something in her that the depths of her depression had not. It made her angry. The realization that her death would be just another repetition of a tired pattern gave her a moment of clarity. She left the clearing, left the forest, and sought help. The psychological interpretation of these experiences is straightforward. The human mind under extreme stress produces hallucinations, particularly when primed by cultural expectations and surrounded by an environment associated with death. Suicidal ideation often involves dissociative states, where the mind separates from immediate reality as a protective mechanism. The reports of watchers and patient presences could easily be projections of the death drive itself, externalized and given form by desperate minds seeking meaning in their final moments. This explanation is rational, evidence-based, and almost certainly accurate for many of the reported encounters. But it does not account for everything. It does not explain why volunteers, who are not in acute psychological distress, and who often have years of experience in the forest, report identical phenomena. It does not address the consistency of descriptions across demographics, time periods, and individual belief systems. And it struggles to explain the experiences of those who enter the forest for innocent reasons, hikers and nature enthusiasts who stumble into the deeper sections and emerge shaken, describing sensations and sightings they cannot rationalize. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, a psychologist who has studied suicide prevention for over 20 years and has worked extensively with Aokigahara survivors, offers a third possibility. Perhaps, he suggests, the forest itself has become a repository of collective trauma. Hundreds of deaths occurring in a concentrated area over decades may have created what he calls a psychic imprint, a kind of emotional residue that sensitive individuals can detect. This is not a supernatural claim, but rather a hypothesis about how environments absorb and reflect human experience. Just as certain buildings feel cold or unwelcoming for reasons we cannot quite identify, perhaps Aokigahara has become saturated with despair to the point where the atmosphere itself communicates this accumulated sorrow to those who enter. Whether the watchers of Aokigahara are spirits, psychological projections, or something else entirely, their impact is undeniable. The forest continues to draw those who seek to end their lives, and it continues to produce reports of presences that observe, wait, and according to some, actively collect. The volunteers continue their difficult work, walking paths they know are watched, searching for the living among the dead, and wrestling with their own experiences of what moves unseen between the trees. And survivors carry forward the memory of patience without mercy, of being seen in their darkest moment by something that did not judge or intervene, but simply waited for the outcome it seemed to know was already written. In the twilight beneath the canopy, where sound dies and shadows pool deeper than they should, the question remains not whether something watches in Aokigahara, but what exactly is doing the watching, and what it has become after decades of witnessing human tragedy in its most intimate and final form. The fluorescent lights in Osaka General Hospital's East Wing hum with a particular frequency at 3 in the morning. It's a sound that Nurse Yoshida Keiko knows intimately, having walked these corridors for 17 years on the night shift. She describes it as almost hypnotic, that electrical drone mixing with the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of slippers on linoleum. But some nights, she says, the familiar rhythm breaks. The air changes, and she knows even before checking the patient board that someone is preparing to leave this world. What she doesn't always expect is that they might have a visitor first. The hospital sits in the Tennoji ward, a sprawling medical complex built in 1973 over what was once a residential neighborhood. The oldest wings retain their original architecture, long corridors with rooms branching off like ribs from a spine. It's in these older sections where the night staff report their most unsettling encounters. Yoshida was the first to speak openly about what she'd seen, breaking a silence that had persisted among her colleagues for years. Once she did, others came forward, their stories remarkably consistent despite being separated by months or even years. The figure appears almost exclusively between midnight and 4 in the morning. Witnesses describe seeing someone walking with clear purpose through the hallways, moving toward a specific room. The clothing is what strikes them first. It's formal but distinctly out of date, something from the early Showa era, the 1920s or 30s. A dark hakama or sometimes a long coat with an old-fashioned cut. The figure is always alone, never hurried, never hesitant. Nurse Tanaka Hiroshi, who has worked the third floor for 9 years, describes the movement as inevitably directed, like someone following directions to an appointment they cannot miss. What makes these sightings particularly unnerving is not fear in the conventional sense. The staff members who report these encounters rarely describe feeling threatened or terrified. Instead, they speak of a profound strangeness, a sense of witnessing something that exists slightly outside the normal flow of reality. Yoshida puts it this way: the figure is there, absolutely visible, solid enough that she expects other people to step aside for it in the hallway. But simultaneously, there's a quality she struggles to name. Not transparent exactly, but not quite fully present either. Like looking at something through glass that's almost but not entirely clean. The pattern became undeniable when Nurse Kobayashi Michiko began keeping informal notes 3 years ago. She didn't set out to document supernatural phenomena. Rather, she was tracking her own experiences for mental health purposes, worried that the stress of her job was causing hallucinations. But as she compared her observations with those of her colleagues, the correlations emerged. In 23 instances where staff reported seeing the figure, a patient died within the next 4 hours. In 19 of those cases, the figure had been seen in the hallway leading to that patient's room, or standing near their doorway. The deaths were all expected, all terminal patients whose families had been prepared for the outcome. But the timing, the specificity of the figure's destination, created a pattern that mere coincidence struggled to explain. Kobayashi describes an encounter from February 2022, a night that crystallized her understanding of what she was witnessing. She was updating charts at the nurse's station on the 4th floor when she noticed someone walking down the corridor to her left. The lights were dim to night levels, but she could see the person clearly. A man in what looked like an old-style black coat, moving with calm deliberation toward room 417. She assumed it was a family member, though visiting hours had long ended. She stood to intercept him, to gently redirect him to come back during appropriate hours. But as she stepped around the desk, the corridor was empty. Not empty as if he'd moved quickly into a room. Empty as if he'd never been there. The quality of the silence was absolute. She checked room 417. The patient there, an elderly woman named Fujimoto-san, was sleeping peacefully. Her vitals were stable, her breathing regular. Kobayashi made a note in her records and returned to her station, unsettled but not alarmed. 2 hours later, Fujimoto-san's monitors signaled a change. She passed quietly at 5:47 in the morning, her daughter holding her hand. When Kobayashi mentioned what she'd seen to another nurse during shift change, the response was immediate recognition. "You saw him too," the colleague said. Not a question, a statement. The psychological weight of working in spaces where death is a regular presence cannot be understated. Healthcare workers in terminal care units develop sophisticated coping mechanisms, ways of maintaining professional composure while processing profound human loss. They speak of compartmentalization, of emotional boundaries that protect them from vicarious trauma. But these barriers can thin, especially during night shifts when the hospital population drops and the building takes on a different character. The liminal quality of these hours, suspended between one day and the next, creates a space where extraordinary experiences feel somehow more permissible. Cultural context provides a framework for understanding these encounters that Western perspectives might lack. The concept of Shinigami, death spirits or death gods, is woven through Japanese folklore and belief systems. Unlike the grim reaper of Western tradition, often depicted as a frightening skeletal figure, Shinigami are more complex. They serve a function, guiding souls from one state of existence to another. They are not necessarily malevolent, though their presence signals an ending. For healthcare workers raised with these cultural narratives, seeing such a figure carries a different resonance than it might elsewhere. It's not proof of mental instability or exhaustion-induced hallucination. It's a manifestation of something already embedded in their understanding of how the world works. Nurse Yamamoto Takakishi, who has worked in palliative care for 12 years, speaks thoughtfully about this intersection of professional training and cultural belief. He describes himself as generally skeptical, someone who trusts medical science and empirical observation. But his experiences have complicated that perspective. He's seen the figure 3 times. Once in 2017, once in 2019, and most recently, in 2023. Each time, a patient died shortly afterward. Each time, the figure appeared calm, purposeful, and somehow both present and absent simultaneously. He struggles with how to categorize these experiences. They don't feel like hallucinations. They feel like observations, like witnessing something real that happens to exist outside the normal parameters of physical reality. The clustering of sightings around specific conditions is striking. They occur almost exclusively with terminal patients who are actively dying, not sudden cardiac events or unexpected complications. The deaths that follow these sightings are what staff describe as good deaths, peaceful passings where the patient seems to let go without struggle. There are no reports of the figure appearing before traumatic deaths or during medical emergencies. This specificity suggests something beyond random occurrence or stress-induced vision. It implies pattern, purpose, perhaps even something that might be called mercy. The time of night is another consistent factor. The hours between midnight and 4 in the morning are known in hospitals as the dying time. Medically, there are explanations for increased mortality during these hours. Circadian rhythms affecting bodily functions, reduced staffing levels meaning delayed response to subtle changes. But the cultural weight of these hours runs deeper. In Japanese tradition, this period, particularly the hour of the ox between 1 and 3 in the morning, holds particular spiritual significance. The boundary between the world of the living and the dead is thought to be thinner then. What the staff at Osaka General Hospital report fits eerily within this traditional understanding. The physical spaces themselves contribute to the phenomenon. Hospital corridors at night become something other than what they are during the day. The same hallways that bustle with doctors, patients, visitors, and equipment during daylight hours transform after dark into long stretches of dimmed lighting and closed doors. The sounds change. Footsteps echo differently. The absence of natural light, the reliance on fluorescent overheads that cast everything in a slightly unreal glow, creates an atmosphere where the boundaries of normal perception feel negotiable. These are liminal spaces in the truest sense, places of transition where patients move between states of being, where the usual rules governing reality seem less fixed. Yoshida describes walking these corridors as an almost meditative experience during the quiet hours. She knows every room, every supply closet, every slight irregularity in the floor tiles. This deep familiarity makes the appearance of the figure all the more striking because it's wrong, in a way her senses immediately register. It's not that she can't see it clearly. She can, but it doesn't belong to the reality she knows, even as it moves through that reality with perfect ease. She's learned to trust these moments, to check on the patients in the direction the figure was heading. More often than not, she finds someone in their final hours, and she can ensure they're not alone, that their pain is managed, that their passing is as gentle as modern medicine can make it. The emotional toll of these experiences varies among the staff. Some find them deeply comforting. Nurse Saito Yumi says that seeing the figure has changed how she understands her role. She no longer sees death as a failure, as something to be prevented at all costs. Instead, she sees herself as part of a larger process, one that includes dimensions beyond the purely physical. The figure, whatever it is, represents to her the continuity of something essential. It suggests that death is not an ending but a transition, one attended by forces or beings whose purpose is to ensure safe passage. This perspective has reduced her anxiety, made the losses she witnesses less devastating. Others struggle more with the ambiguity. Nurse Watanabe Ken finds the sightings disturbing not because they frighten him but because they challenge his understanding of reality. He's a man who values concrete answers, clear categories. The figure exists in a space between rational explanation and inexplicable phenomenon that leaves him uneasy. He's considered leaving night shift work, moving to a position where he wouldn't be present during these hours. But something keeps him there. Perhaps, he admits, because some part of him needs to understand what he's witnessing, even if understanding remains perpetually just out of reach. The hospital administration is aware of these reports, but maintains a studied neutrality. There have been no official investigations, no acknowledgement in any formal capacity. This silence is itself telling, a recognition that some experiences within these walls cannot be addressed through bureaucratic channels. The night shift staff have their own understanding, their own way of processing what they encounter. Management's unspoken position seems to be that, as long as patient care remains excellent and staff maintain their professionalism, the mysteries of the night shift can remain just that, mysteries. What emerges from these testimonies is a portrait of healthcare workers navigating multiple realities simultaneously. They function within the rigorous framework of modern medicine, using technology and training to care for the dying. But they also exist within a cultural and spiritual context that acknowledges dimensions beyond the physical. The figure in outdated clothing becomes a bridge between these worlds, a manifestation of something that both confounds empirical understanding and fits perfectly within traditional belief systems. Whether one interprets these sightings as genuine supernatural encounters, culturally shaped hallucinations, or some third category that our current frameworks cannot adequately address, their impact on those who experience them is undeniable. In the quiet corridors of Osaka General Hospital, during the hours when the boundary between day and night grows thin, the staff bear witness to something that challenges the neat categories we use to organize our world. And in that witnessing, they find their own ways to make meaning from the mystery. The train platforms of Tokyo became something else entirely in the years between 1997 and 2003. They became stages for a tragedy so vast, so relentless, that station attendants began to recognize a pattern in how people stood. Too close to the yellow line. Too still. eyes focused on some distant point that had nothing to do with waiting for the next arrival. The railway companies quietly installed mirrors along the platforms, a psychological intervention based on the theory that seeing their own reflection might break the spell, might remind people of their physical presence in the world. But the numbers kept climbing. 30,000 lives per year. Then 32,000. Then 35,000. Deaths so frequent that newspapers created a special statistical category, tracking them like weather patterns, like natural disasters that struck with predictable regularity. This was Japan's lost decade, though that name sanitizes what it truly meant to live through it. The economic bubble that had inflated throughout the 1980s burst with such violence that the entire architecture of Japanese society seemed to crack. Companies that had promised lifetime employment began conducting what they called restructuring. Men who had devoted every waking hour to their corporations for 20, 30 years found themselves suddenly disposable. The word used was risitora, a loan word from English that somehow made the devastation sound technical, manageable, temporary. But there was nothing temporary about it. The unemployment rate climbed. Savings evaporated. Families lost homes. And people began vanishing from their lives in numbers that shocked even a culture familiar with suicide as a historical phenomena. What made this period different? What elevated it beyond economic catastrophe into something that seemed to touch the supernatural were the stories that began circulating among survivors. The ones who had stood on those platforms, who had walked to the edges of tall buildings, who had prepared the rope or filled the bathtub, but somehow, for reasons they couldn't fully articulate, had stepped back. Mental health workers, crisis counselors, the few researchers brave enough to study the phenomenon up close, they all began hearing the same descriptions. Not just of depression, not just of hopelessness, but of something external. A presence, a voice, a pull that felt separate from their own thoughts. Dr. Takahashi's research began almost by accident in 21, when he was working as a psychiatrist at a hospital in Yokohama. A patient, a 47-year-old salaryman, who had attempted to jump from his apartment building but had been physically restrained by a neighbor, described his experience in terms that troubled the doctor deeply. The man said he had felt calm, completely certain, as he climbed onto the balcony railing. He described hearing what he called a gentle voice, neither male nor female, speaking to him in the most reasonable tone imaginable. It told him that this was the solution, that his family would be better off with the insurance money, that his pain would end and he would finally be able to rest. But here was what made Dr. Takahashi pause in his note-taking. The man insisted this voice was not his own thought. He could feel the difference, he said, between his internal dialogue and this other thing. It came from beside him, slightly behind, like someone standing just out of his peripheral vision. One case could be dismissed. The brain under extreme stress produces all manner of phenomena. But Dr. Takahashi began asking other survivors about their experiences, carefully, without leading questions. He interviewed 73 people over the next 2 years, all of whom had survived serious suicide attempts. What he found shook his materialist, Western-trained understanding of psychology. 41 of them, more than half, described some form of external presence during their attempt. The descriptions varied, but certain elements repeated with unsettling consistency. A feeling of being guided, a voice that sounded helpful, even kind, a sense that someone was there with them, making it easier, smoothing the path toward death. One woman, a 32-year-old office worker who had stood on a train platform for 40 minutes before finally stepping back, told him she had felt a hand on her shoulder. Not pushing, she emphasized, supporting, like a friend standing with her, keeping her company, making sure she wouldn't lose her nerve. She remembered thinking how thoughtful it was, how this presence understood her pain in a way no living person had. When Dr. Takahashi asked what made her step back from the platform, she became quiet for a long moment. Then she said she had glimpsed its reflection in the mirror the railway company had installed. And for just an instant, she saw that the thing standing behind her had no face, just a suggestion of features, like a watercolor left in the rain. The shock of that impossible sight broke whatever hold it had on her. These accounts accumulated in Dr. Takahashi's files, each one a small piece of a larger, more disturbing picture. A businessman described a figure in traditional robes who walked alongside him as he drove toward a famous suicide spot in the Aokigahara forest, visible only in his peripheral vision, disappearing when he turned his head. A student spoke of a presence in her apartment that made the act of preparing sleeping pills feel cooperative, like cooking a meal with a helpful companion who handed her each bottle, who nodded encouragement, who made it all feel so natural and right. A construction worker said he heard humming, a lullaby almost, as he tied the rope, and he felt such gratitude toward whatever was making this terrible moment feel peaceful. The psychological establishment did not welcome Dr. Takahashi's findings. His paper, submitted to 3 different journals, was rejected by all of them. The feedback was consistent. These were clearly hallucinations born of extreme psychological distress. To suggest otherwise, to give credence to the idea of external entities, was irresponsible and unscientific. It played into cultural superstitions that had no place in modern psychiatry. One reviewer wrote that publishing such material could be actively dangerous, potentially encouraging the very phenomena it claimed to study. Dr. Takahashi's research was quietly buried, existing now only in unpublished manuscripts and the memories of those he interviewed. But the cultural conversation could not be suppressed so easily. People began talking about Shinigami in ways they hadn't for generations. The ancient belief in death gods, beings that guided souls from life to death, suddenly felt relevant again. Not as folklore, not as historical curiosity, but as explanation for something that too many people were experiencing. Online forums filled with discussions. Support groups for those who had lost family members to suicide whispered about it. Had their loved ones been alone at the end, or had something been there with them, making it easier, making it feel inevitable? The sociological implications cut deep into questions of cultural psychology. Japan's relationship with suicide has always been complex, woven through with historical threads of honor, sacrifice, and aesthetic tragedy. The samurai tradition of seppuku, the wartime kamikazes, the literary glorification of dying beautifully. But this was different. This was mass death, driven by economic systems that had failed, by a social structure that measured human worth in productivity, and then discarded those who could no longer produce. The question that haunted researchers was whether the cultural framework of Shinigami, deeply embedded in the collective consciousness, created a psychological template. Did belief in death gods provide a shape for self-destructive impulses to take, an externalized form that made the unbearable feel like guidance from something larger than the individual will? One theory suggested that in a culture where expressing negative emotions was deeply discouraged, where burden on others was considered shameful, the psyche needed a way to externalize the impulse toward self-destruction. It couldn't be the self wanting to die. That would be weakness. That would be failure. But if it was something external, a force beyond individual control, then there was no shame in it. The Shinigami became a culturally available explanation, a framework through which unbearable psychological pain could be processed and acted upon. The presence that survivors described might be a projection, a dissociative split where the part of the mind driving toward death takes on an independent existence, speaks in a different voice, appears as a separate entity. But the survivors themselves often rejected this interpretation. They insisted they knew the difference between their own thoughts and this other thing. They described the presence as having qualities, characteristics, intentions that felt utterly foreign to their own consciousness. Some said it felt ancient. Others said it felt patient, like it had all the time in the world and had been waiting specifically for them. One man told Dr. Takahashi that the presence had known his name, his real name that only his grandmother had used, and hearing it spoken in that gentle voice had almost convinced him that death would be a homecoming. The years of the crisis have passed. Japan's economy slowly stabilized. The suicide rates, while still troubling, have declined from their peak. The mirrors remain on the train platforms, along with other interventions. Crisis hotlines, mandatory cooling-off periods for life insurance payouts, increased mental health resources. But those who worked on the front lines during those dark years carry something with them. The crisis counselors, the researchers, the railway employees who saw too much. They speak carefully when asked about it, aware of how it sounds, but many of them admit privately that they came to believe something was there, that the volume of death, the concentration of despair, had perhaps called something into being, or called something back from the depths of cultural memory where it had been waiting. The question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Were the Shinigami always there, ancient and patient, waiting for moments when the veil between worlds grows thin with collective suffering? Or did belief in them create the psychological conditions for their manifestation, thought forms given shape by cultural expectation and individual desperation? In the end, the distinction might not matter. What remains certain is that during Japan's darkest modern period, thousands of people at the edge of death reported feeling they were not alone, that something was there with them, making it easier to let go. And whether that presence was neurological, cultural, or something that exists in the spaces between those categories, it left traces in the testimony of survivors that resist easy explanation. The darkness that called to them wore a familiar face, one their ancestors would have recognized, one that whispered in a language older than economics, older than shame, as old as the human confrontation with mortality itself. The water closed over Takeshi Yamamoto's head with a silence that felt absolute, almost sacred. This was not the violent chaos he expected drowning to be. Instead, the Sumida River, in late March of 2015, became something else entirely, a threshold between one state of existence and another. He would later tell researchers at Tokyo University's Consciousness Studies Department that the temperature disappeared first, followed by the panic, followed by everything he thought he understood about the boundary between life and death. Yamamoto, a 32-year-old graphic designer, had fallen from a pedestrian bridge during an evening commute, his briefcase still clutched in one hand as he hit the water. The fall itself was an accident, witnesses confirmed, a stumble backward over a low railing he'd been leaning against while taking a phone call. But what happened in the 4 minutes before emergency responders pulled his body from the river would become one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of an encounter with what he could only describe as a Shinigami, a death god from Japanese tradition. He described the transition as instantaneous. One moment, river water filling his lungs, his body tumbling in the current. The next moment, standing in a space that defied easy description. Not darkness, he emphasized repeatedly in interviews, but an absence that felt different from mere lack of light. A neutrality that extended in all directions. The closest comparison he could make was to standing in dense fog at twilight, that moment when day hasn't quite ended, but night hasn't quite begun. The figure stood approximately 3 meters away. Yamamoto was adamant about certain details, while admitting uncertainty about others. The entity appeared humanoid, dressed in what resembled a dark hakama, the traditional divided skirt worn in formal Japanese contexts. But the face remained indistinct, not hidden or obscured, but somehow resistant to direct observation. When Yamamoto tried to focus on the features, his attention would slide away, as if his consciousness lacked the proper framework to process what he was seeing. What struck him most forcefully was the complete absence of emotion emanating from this presence. Not coldness, he insisted, not malice or threat, but a profound neutrality that felt almost bureaucratic in its detachment. The figure spoke, though Yamamoto couldn't say whether he heard actual words or simply understood meaning directly. The communication bypassed language entirely, he explained, arriving in his mind as complete thoughts rather than sequential sounds. The message was straightforward, almost mundane in its directness. Yamamoto had reached a point of decision. The figure explained, or perhaps simply conveyed, that the physical damage to his body had not yet crossed the threshold of irreversibility. His brain remained viable. His heart could restart. But the choice of whether to return belonged to him, and this choice needed to be made immediately. The window of possibility was narrow, measured in moments rather than minutes. What followed was not a judgment, Yamamoto stressed, but something closer to an evaluation, a neutral assessment of his life's trajectory. The figure didn't present a moral ledger or weigh his actions against some cosmic standard. Instead, Yamamoto experienced a sudden complete awareness of his existence as a whole, seeing his relationships, his choices, his impacts on others with a clarity that felt almost painful in its honesty. He saw his wife's face, his daughter's childhood, the small kindnesses he'd shown, and the small cruelties he'd committed. Everything existed simultaneously, not as a chronological review, but as a single, unified perception of what his life had meant. The figure asked a question, or perhaps posed a possibility. Did he wish to continue forward or return backward? Both were presented as equally valid options, neither advocated for nor discouraged. The absence of guidance was itself striking, Yamamoto recalled. No reassurance that returning was the right choice, no promise that continuing onward would lead to peace or transcendence. Simply two paths, and a moment to choose. He chose to return, though when researchers asked him to explain his reasoning, his answers became vague, uncertain. He remembered thinking of his daughter, who was 7 at the time. He remembered a sense of incompleteness, of threads left dangling. But he also remembered something else, something he found difficult to articulate. The space beyond, the direction he had not chosen, didn't radiate fear or peace, joy or suffering. It simply existed as a continuation, different from life, but not necessarily better or worse. The transition back was equally abrupt. One moment, standing in that neutral space with the figure in dark clothing. The next moment, pain exploding in his chest as paramedics performed compressions. Water erupting from his lungs as his body convulsed back into life. The physical shock was immense, he recalled, like being slammed against a wall of sensation after existing in pure abstraction. Yamamoto's account gained attention, not because it was unique, but because it was remarkably consistent with other documented experiences. Dr. Kaiko Morita, a psychologist specializing in near-death experiences at Kyoto University, has collected more than 40 detailed accounts from Japanese survivors who reported encounters with entities during clinical death. The patterns that emerge are striking in their repetition. A 67-year-old woman who suffered cardiac arrest during surgery in Osaka in 2013 described an almost identical scenario. A figure in traditional clothing, features unclear, standing in a space that felt liminal and undefined. The same sense of evaluation without judgment. The same presentation of choice without advocacy. She chose to return, she told researchers, because her grandson was scheduled to graduate from high school that spring, and she wanted to attend the ceremony. A 19-year-old man who overdosed in Sapporo in 2017 reported meeting what he called a presence rather than a person, something that existed more as a function than an individual. He described it as feeling like encountering a gatekeeper or a station master, someone whose role was to manage transitions rather than to make them. The presence offered him a choice, he said, and seemed genuinely indifferent to which option he selected. What makes these accounts particularly compelling from a research perspective is the consistency across demographics. The witnesses range in age from teenagers to the elderly, come from various socioeconomic backgrounds, and hold different levels of religious observance. Some were practicing Buddhists, others followed Shinto traditions, several identified as secular or non-religious. Yet, the details of their encounters align in ways that resist easy dismissal as cultural conditioning or shared expectation. The concept of bardo states in Tibetan Buddhist tradition provides a framework that resonates with these experiences. The bardo, literally meaning intermediate state, describes the consciousness that exists between death and rebirth. In traditional teachings, the bardo is a period of evaluation and transition, where the consciousness encounters various visions and presences that reflect both external reality and internal karma. The Bardo Thodal, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes in detail the stages of consciousness after death. The initial phase, called the Chikai Bardo, occurs at the moment of death itself, when the clear light of reality becomes briefly visible to the consciousness. This is followed by the Chonyed Bardo, where the consciousness encounters various peaceful and wrathful deities, not as external entities, but as manifestations of one's own mind and karma. What's remarkable is how closely some aspects of these Tibetan teachings align with the Japanese near-death accounts. The emphasis on choice, the absence of external judgment in favor of self-recognition, the liminal quality of the space itself, all appear in both the ancient texts and the contemporary testimony. The primary difference lies in the cultural interpretation of the entities encountered. Where Tibetan Buddhism describes elaborate pantheons of deities, Japanese witnesses consistently identify their encounters as Shinigami. The Shinigami of folklore, however, doesn't quite match these modern descriptions. Traditional stories portray Shinigami as active agents, entities that persuade or trick humans into death, that appear at moments of despair to encourage suicide, that collect souls as part of a cosmic bureaucracy. The Shinigami of Edo period kabuki theater was often a malevolent figure, a tempter or a threat, but the entities described in contemporary near-death accounts display none of this active malevolence. They don't persuade or trick. They don't encourage or discourage. They simply present information and offer choice. This neutrality itself may represent an evolution in cultural understanding, a modern interpretation that strips away the theatrical elements and retains only the core function, a presence that marks the boundary between life and death. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, a folklorist at Waseda University, suggests that what we're witnessing is the real-time evolution of a cultural archetype. The Shinigami concept, he argues, has always been flexible, adapting to reflect contemporary anxieties and understandings of death. In an era where death is increasingly medicalized, where we have precise definitions of clinical death and brain death and cardiac death, it makes sense that the cultural representation of death's guardian would become more clinical as well, more neutral, more procedural. More procedural. The question that haunts researchers is whether these experiences represent cultural interpretation of universal phenomena, or whether Japanese witnesses are encountering something genuinely distinct. Near-death experiences occur globally, across all cultures, but the details vary significantly. Western accounts often feature tunnels of light, deceased relatives, a being of light or divine presence. Indian accounts frequently include bureaucratic errors, Yamadutas, or messengers of Yama sent to collect the wrong person. Japanese accounts center on this figure in traditional dress, this neutral presence offering choice. The consistency of the choice element across Japanese accounts is particularly noteworthy. In Yamamoto's case, and in dozens of others documented by researchers, the emphasis falls squarely on personal agency. The entity doesn't decide. The entity doesn't judge worthiness. The entity simply facilitates a decision that belongs entirely to the individual consciousness. This aligns powerfully with certain Buddhist concepts of karma and personal responsibility, the idea that we are ultimately the architects of our own spiritual trajectory. Yet something about these encounters resists complete reduction to cultural expectation. The witnesses describe details they claim they had no prior knowledge of, aspects of the experience that surprised or confused them. Several mention the strange quality of communication without language. Others emphasize the unsettling neutrality, noting that they expected fear or peace or something definable, but encountered instead this absolute absence of emotional temperature. The drowning victim Takeshi Yamamoto lived for 8 more years after his encounter. He died in 2023 from unrelated causes, a cancer diagnosis that gave him months to prepare for his final transition. Before his death, he gave a final interview to Dr. Morita's research team. When asked if he feared death, knowing what awaited him, his answer was carefully considered. He said he felt neither fear nor anticipation, only a kind of curiosity. He expected he would see the figure again, he said, standing in that space that wasn't quite darkness. He expected another choice would be offered, though this time, the physical possibility of return would be closed. And he expected the same absolute neutrality, the same absence of judgment or warmth, the same sense that death was not an ending or a beginning, but simply a threshold, and that crossing it was ultimately his decision alone. The rain hasn't stopped. It never really stops in these stories, does it? The steady percussion against windows, the way water pools in gutters and streams down darkened streets, the particular quality of silence that exists between one drop and the next. We began here, in this rain-soaked darkness, and now we return. But the questions we carry back are heavier, more insistent, less willing to be ignored. What do we do with consistency? What do we do with the fact that across 400 years, across islands separated by hundreds of miles, across social classes and education levels and cultural shifts that transformed Japan from feudal society to global technological power, the descriptions remain eerily, stubbornly similar? Stubbornly similar? The figure at the threshold, the sense of recognition before seeing, the absence of terror where terror should live. The quiet certainty that follows. These are not vague impressions molded by cultural expectation. These are specific, recurring details and testimonies that should have no connection to one another. We have traced these accounts through centuries. We have sat with the discomfort of stories that refuse easy explanation. And we are left, ultimately, where all honest investigations of the supernatural must end, in the borderland between what we can prove and what we cannot dismiss. The scientific method, that most reliable of tools, extends only so far before the questions themselves change shape, becoming not about evidence but about meaning, not about proof but about truth of a different kind. Perhaps what unsettles most is not the possibility that Shinigami exist, but what their existence in Japanese consciousness reveals about a fundamentally different relationship with death itself. Not feared as Western devils are feared, not welcomed as angels might be welcomed, but acknowledged, recognized, expected. In the space where Western thought sees only ending, Japanese tradition sees transition, continuity, and, yes, companionship. Death is not an interruption, but an appointment. And appointments require someone to keep them. The rain continues. And somewhere tonight, in some room lit by the blue glow of a phone screen or the warm amber of a bedside lamp, someone pauses, listens, feels the particular quality of presence that has no source. In a culture where death gods have names and faces, mortality becomes not more frightening, but more intimate, more patient, more real. The question is not whether you believe. The question is whether belief itself has power we cannot measure. Listen, and the rain knows. It always has. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.